delighted that you can be here with us this afternoon. We have, as you can all tell, folks from pretty much all over the country in our neck of the woods, all the way out to California and the East Coast as well. My name is Shiva Sundaresan. I am the Conservation Director at the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and formally welcome to what we're calling our Protect What You Love webinar series. As Christy was mentioning earlier, this pandemic has given us somewhat of an unusual opportunity to connect with our people virtually. And so this is the second of 3 webinars we're doing where we talk about some of our work. Today, you're going to hear from 2 of our staff, our Montana Conservation Coordinator, Darcie Warden, and our Senior Wildlife Conservation Associate, Brooke Shifrin, and they're going to be talking to us about conserving open landscapes and the relationship between public and private land. You'll hear from Darcie and Brooke for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then after that, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. Hopefully, you guys have figured out the chat. It certainly looks so. You can put your questions in the chat box, and if we are able to, you can raise your hand and we might be able to call on you, but it may be easier if you just put your questions in the chat box. If you'd like to do that as we go along, Christy and I will do our best to keep track of it and make sure we get to answer those questions at the end of Darcie and Brooke's presentation. So just that's a little bit about the logistics. I'll introduce Darcie and Brooke, and then we'll dive right in. So Darcie is our Montana Conservation Coordinator. She leads our work in Montana, and she's been with GYC for about 6 years. During this time, she's built relationships, really deep and committed relationships with various people that we work with, ranchers, agency folks, to citizens. And today you're going to be hearing from her on work in the area of what we call the High Divide of Montana. And this is one aspect of a sort of wide gamut of work that she does that includes also protecting Montana's forests and sort of work in other parts of the ecosystem, including in the Gallatin area. Also with Darcie today is Brooke Shifrin. Brooke has been with GYC for about 5 years. And she is our wildlife expert. She did her master's on grizzly bears and leads almost all of our work to prevent the conflicts that grizzly bears and people have, all towards working so that we can keep people safe and bears wild. She works closely with Darcie on this work in the High Divide, specifically with a group of ranchers in the Ruby Valley, to ensure that some of these crucial lands that you're going to hear them talk about remain protected, open, and it makes it easy for grizzly bears to connect between these lands in the Yellowstone ecosystem to lands further north. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Darcie and Brooke, and you can hear a little bit about our work and then sort of have an opportunity of questions at the end. Thank you so much, Darcie, Brooke.
Thank you, Shiva. So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, and then we'll enter into our presentation. But I humbly offer this, and I will read it because I certainly have not memorized it. We acknowledge and honor with respect the Indigenous custodians on whose traditional territories within the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and whose historical relationships with the land continues to this day. We ask the spiritual ancestors to forgive our intrusion and humbly ask for their guidance. GYC acknowledges and thanks descendants for their guidance in developing this land acknowledgement. The Greater Yellowstone area was a gathering place for at least 30 tribes and most likely more. There is so much we don't know, so we humbly provide this acknowledgement for the land and the people before us, with us, and those to come. I am committed to my continued learning about Native people and the history of this place. So thank you for being with us in the acknowledgement. And we'll begin. Oh my gosh, it's been working the whole time. Hang on. There we are. Just to begin with a little background, I'd like to begin with just placing ourselves in the ecosystem. So the map on the right is the GYC map that we use as we work in the entire ecosystem. The red circle is the area that I really work in and Brooke and I partner in. And so the first acknowledgement I want to just offer here is that the entire ecosystem of Greater Yellowstone is diverse. The people are diverse, the geography is diverse, the cultures throughout the region are their own. And so when I'm sharing my work, it really is the perspective of Southwest Montana. So I just offer that perspective. As I work in conservation on public and private lands, the thing that we are mostly working towards is to maintain the connected landscapes. And as we know, wildlife do not see boundaries. They don't see the boundaries between public and private land. And so our job is to maintain open space on public and private land, to acknowledge that there are different users and different uses on public and private land, and to work within those uses and with those people in those areas. And that, and we'll get to this a little bit more, but just acknowledging right now that when people are operating, like when producers who are raising cattle or sheep are operating on private lands, they oftentimes need public lands to be a viable operation. If they don't have access to those to the public lands, they may not have a viable operation, and then their private land is at risk in terms of being sold and developed. But we'll get into that a little bit more. So moving on to the next slide. So that's what we're talking about. It's really, that's my take home here. The take home is we need both. We need public and private lands for wild open space for animals to move through. So if anything you remember, it's that. So Brooke, we've got a really beautiful map in front of us here. What is it telling us?
Thanks, Darcie. Well, I'll start by saying that this map on the left here is important because one of GYC's long-term goals is to see grizzly bears in the Greater Yellowstone region connect to other populations of grizzly bears. And that's because interconnected populations are healthier and more resilient over the long term. So the map on the left shows some work done by a group of grizzly bear scientists to model potential movements of male grizzly bears between the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And so those areas in purple represent highly probable corridors for grizzly bears to be able to disperse from the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem to the north and west. And the green areas on the map represent public land, while the white areas represent private land. And as you can see, private lands overlap with valuable grizzly bear habitat in these connective landscapes. This map is just a model, and as such, it has limitations. I think it's certainly unrealistic to think that these purple corridors alone are the key to seeing grizzly bear populations connect. And in all reality, grizzly bear range expansion happens slowly and incrementally over time. But what this map does really illuminate is the importance of this broader landscape where we are working in Southwest Montana. And as Darcie alluded to, private working ranch lands play a crucial role in providing connected habitat for wildlife.
And that's what we're looking at here, actually. So this photo is in the Ruby Valley, and the entire valley bottom here is private land. So as you can see, it's wide open space, lots of wildlife habitat in here. And we're very interested in maintaining this open space with the private landowners, and most of these folks are operators, are raising cattle. So one of the things that I really want to point out here that I think is important is that this private land is tied to, in terms of their operations and their business model, it's tied to public land. So if they were not able to move their cattle onto the public land for some of their grazing season, they would not be able to run their operation. And if they're not able to run their operation, they're not able to maintain, and they'll have to sell. And what we would be seeing here, this is a beautiful area. And so if they were to sell, and what we're seeing right now is a lot of it, the development would be coming in pretty quickly. And that's just, we're seeing that in other areas, and we know that to be a reality. So for connectivity and for healthy communities, we really do want to protect this private land with the landowners. And then here we have pictures of the public land. So here are 2 grazing allotments. Brooke and I had the opportunity to go out and ride with a couple of cowboys. And as you can see, wide open space here as well. And the cowboys take a lot of time to work with the cattle, manage the fencing, manage the watering, and ensure that, you know, sensitive habitat areas are well taken care of. And so we also work with them to maintain that area, but we're also working with them to reduce conflicts, because there's the expanding grizzly bear population, and that's something that they're feeling the reality of out on the landscape on the public lands. So on that note, Brooke, what are we looking at here with this map?
Yeah, so grizzly bears really are a conservation success story in the Greater Yellowstone region. And the availability of secure habitat, like the picture that Darcie showed in that last slide, has played an important role among many other things in that success. So on this map, the area outlined in yellow represents what is known as the original recovery zone for Greater Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly bears. And the blue outline shows you where biologists assess the status of Greater Yellowstone grizzly bears through monitoring important indicators of population and demographic health. And the green area that you see changing over time on this map demonstrates grizzly bear distribution. So as you watch through the time series, and the year is marked there at the top of the map, you'll see a pretty remarkable level of expansion by Yellowstone grizzly bears over the years. And then there at the end of the time series, there will be some grizzly bear symbols that pop up, and those are essentially confirmed sightings of grizzly bears outside that area in which they're currently monitored. Just let it run through to the end there.
And I'll just point out, we're talking about this, can people see my cursor? We're talking about this area here is where we're spending a lot of our time.
Thanks, Darcie.
Yeah.
All right, next slide. This conservation success story also comes with challenges for those that live and work in landscapes shared with grizzly bears, as Darcie alluded to. The map on the left there is Southwest Montana, and all of the points represented by different symbols in red and black and green and other colors identify locations of conflict incidences between grizzly bears and people in 2019. So those range from encounters with people that led to some sort of incident to occurrences of grizzly bears getting into human trash or other attractants and livestock depredations as well. So as grizzly bears are expanding into historic habitat, they're kind of colliding with communities that in many cases are recalibrating to the challenges of living alongside these animals. And these conflict incidences are not only bad for people, but they also really degrade social tolerance for grizzly bears, and management action taken in response to these conflicts can often lead to dead bears. We know that conflicts with people are the primary source of grizzly bear mortality in the region. And we also know that ultimately, if grizzly bears are going to be successful in this landscape that is so important for connecting grizzly bear populations, that social tolerance for their presence and minimizing conflicts will be incredibly important. The photo there on the right shows multiple grizzly bears feeding on a dead cow in the gravelly mountains that Darcie pointed out in the previous slide. And Darcie, I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about what you hear from some of the ranchers we work with in Southwest Montana around the nature of the challenges they're up against.
Yeah, there's two main challenges, and then one request that I continue to hear from our partners. Number one is safety. They really want to make sure that their folks who are riding out there are safe. And then the second one is they're losing cattle to station. So that's a hit to their business, right? So there's a loss there. So that's troubling for them too. And because they know that they really do their work out there, they're there to stay. They know the bears are there to stay too as they're coming in. So they're getting really creative as well with us around what else can we do? We want to be able to make this work. So what ideas do we have about conflict reduction? So we're talking about different types of technology we could use, and different projects that we can try and implement on the ground, and they're really open to that. So how do we address these challenges? Well, like I just spoke to, there's the collaboration with our producers, and we work directly in conflict reduction actions and brainstorming, policy advocacy, wildlife friendly fencing, and public lands protection. And with all of these ways that we work, it always involves people. It always involves working with folks on the ground in the community. As you can see on the far right, that's where we were visiting a rancher where they were calving. So we actually saw a baby cow be born that day. It was very sweet. So the collaboration that is really kind of the basis of my work is with a group called the Ruby Valley Strategic Alliance. And we were formed in 2016. It was really led by a local rancher who on the far left here is wearing the cowboy hat and speaking to the group, Rick Sandrew. And he brought a bunch of folks together. So conservation people and local elected people and other ranchers. And the other ranchers were just like, I don't know about this. But 5 years later, we are an incredibly strong group working together with our shared values for the landscape and really making progress and kind of being the example of how things can be done out there. We do education around what conservation efforts are taking place on the ranch lands and private lands and also on the public allotments. And we work on policy and forest and range management. One of the other things that happens for us as conservationists is we get invited to a number of different activities that are taking place. And in these two pictures, we were invited to one of the ranchers' shearing events, I guess you could say. And we got to see firsthand sheep coming in and being sheared and then being taken out to the pen and they use paint actually for marking the sheep. And I just want to point out this picture on the right. So this, I think that day it must have been in the high teens or low 20s Fahrenheit degrees. And we were in a barn and these guys are working so hard and the music is blasting and they are just shearing away. And I was dressed like I was, in the left here the entire time and I was freezing. So these guys are working hard. And it was really eye-opening actually to really get into like how that operation takes place. And it was really a treat for John Helly to open his door to us and let us participate that day. And Brooke, what's your experience in terms of our work with the ranchers and producers?
Yeah, well, if you want to go to the next slide, Darcie. Yeah, so we've tried to spend a lot of time learning more from our partners about the complexity of the challenges around wildlife conflict in this landscape. So in this picture are Amber and Andy, who are working cow hands. And Darcie and I had the opportunity to spend the day with Amber and Andy on horseback, riding through one of the public land allotments where they graze cattle. And these kinds of experiences have been really eye-opening for me. Cow hands like Amber and Andy have an enormous workload. They're checking and doctoring cattle, they're repairing fence, they're moving cows, and like all of this is no small feat in a landscape that is characterized by such vast country. You have densely forested areas with poor visibility, you have rugged terrain, and there are thousands of cattle and very few people. So when you add in the need to manage the risk of predation by grizzly bears and wolves, the task at hand for folks like Amber and Andy becomes nearly impossible. And then, as in many places, this landscape is diverse, and the risk of conflict in terms of predation varies a lot depending on the specific context. So the reality is that there's not a one size fits all approach to preventing livestock predation events. And then the other thing that we've learned is just the degree to which these people's safety and the safety of their employees and their fellow riders is really on the forefront of their mind as grizzly bears are expanding into historic habitat. Next slide, please.
Before I switch, I'll just note real quickly, Amber on the left, she's got her bear spray right underneath her arm here. And Andy has got his pistol on the saddle. These two are no strangers to bears.
And perhaps most important of all, I think all the time we've spent listening and learning from our partners has really illuminated for us all the ways in which these ranchers are already working really hard and implementing a whole bunch of tools to prevent predator conflicts from occurring. In this picture is a livestock guard dog working for one of the sheep ranchers we partner with in the Ruby Valley Strategic Alliance. Darcie, perhaps you could share a bit more about how we're responding to all of these things we've learned, starting with the workshops.
Yeah, thanks, Brooke. So we have been interviewing people and asking questions and really digging in and figuring out what is it that people want to know. And we learned that the riders are really interested in learning more from each other about what they're experiencing and how they're handling things out when they're riding. And they're also interested in first aid. As you can see on the left slide here, things can happen out when they basically live out there. So when something goes wrong, they need to be able to have the tools and the know-how to deal with it right there. So we were providing that training. We're also working on bear behavior is something that folks are interested in. So when we hold our workshops in the summer, there's, how do bears behave? What do you do when you come up to a cow or a sheep that's been killed? And so we have our agency partners there to work with us. And so Brooke, can you tell us a little bit more about the agency partnership we have?
Sure. Yeah. So one of our big takeaways from everything we've heard is that there simply isn't enough human capacity on the ground on these public land grazing allotments to effectively prevent and respond to conflicts. Our friends at Natural Resources Defense Council and Defenders of Wildlife recently successfully lobbied for some new federal funding for non-lethal conflict prevention efforts through wildlife services. And this new funding created an opportunity for us to then develop a cost share partnership with Wildlife Services to establish a new Wildlife Services position that would be dedicated to the Gravelly Mountains that could focus solely on non-lethal conflict prevention and response. And Western Landowners Alliance and Vital Ground Foundation supported this project in its pilot year last year as well. So the new Wildlife Services employee started last summer and he will be back this year. He rides the allotments on horseback and looks for wildlife sign as well as sick or injured cattle that could be susceptible to predation. He also documents evidence at potential kill sites so that producers can be compensated for livestock lost to predation. And I think really the most important role of this person is communication with the producers and other riders about wildlife activity so that they can respond accordingly. And then responding to their calls when a predation event is suspected. And so bringing people together at these workshops is really a great opportunity for facilitating that information exchange and improving communication between the riders and the producers and the agency. And as Darcie mentioned, these gatherings are a great opportunity to talk about other aspects of bear safety and practice using bear spray, discuss first aid, and all kinds of other safety considerations in grizzly bear country. Next slide, please. Another important aspect of our work in partnership with the agencies is partnering with the U.S. Forest Service on conflict prevention projects. Shipping containers like that pictured here are a super effective way to secure attractants like food and horse grain and trash that cowhands and riders may have at their cow camps on public land allotments. And so last summer, we partnered with the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest to put these containers at several cow camps in the Gravelly Mountains. Next slide. And also important to GYC is securing policy change that supports our grizzly bear conservation goals and addresses the challenges of sharing the landscape with this species. The groups that participate in the Ruby Valley Strategic Alliance represent a wide variety of interests. So when a group like that agrees on policy or management needs, those recommendations have the potential to be pretty influential in Montana. As an example, we worked closely with the ranchers and other organizations in the Ruby Valley Strategic Alliance to craft a letter outlining grizzly bear conservation recommendations to the Montana Grizzly Bear Advisory Council. And that was a citizens task force appointed by our previous Montana governor. Many of the recommendations we made in our letter can be found in the council's final report, and hopefully that report will serve as the foundation for any future grizzly bear management plan in Montana. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Darcie to talk about another important aspect of conserving these landscapes for wildlife, which is addressing the physical barriers that make habitat inaccessible or less permeable to wildlife moving or dispersing to new places.
Thanks, Brooke. So one of my favorite pieces of the work, and I'll explain why in the next slide, is removing, modifying, or building new fence that is friendly to deer and elk and pronghorn as they move through the landscape. As you'll see in the left slide here, the deer can get bunched up on a fence, struggle getting through, and oftentimes there's a road that they're crossing. And the roads that we've been working on are main trucking highways. So they're super dangerous when it comes to wildlife vehicle collision. And but we work with private landowners and public agencies, and we've been able to get out there. And in the far right here is a fence that has been knocked over and moved around and tangled into by deer and elk and pronghorn. So what we're doing is creating a fence that doesn't get knocked down so much so that people have to repair it every year, which is a pain in the butt. And then animals can move through. So in these slides, we're modifying a fence on the left and we're building a new fence on the right. And the reason I say this work is fun is because we have a little gas powered, little like lawnmower engine wire winder. And this thing, it winds up the wire into a tight little spool, and you just dump it off the spool and you take it over to metal recycling. And it's the easiest thing that can be done. Before we got the wire winder, we were doing this work by hand with barbed wire fence. And that was not fun. So we, over the last couple of years, we've accomplished 7 miles, just either changing, rebuilding, or removing 7 miles of fence. And we just keep on going with it. It's a fun project. Brooke, what are the other aspects of the fencing work that you think is worthwhile and sharing with our friends here?
Yeah, you know, in addition to the benefits for wildlife, when we're really, you know, strategic about where we do these projects, there's also a lot of less tangible benefits to these projects. They help us build positive working relationships with public land managers and private landowners, and they offer opportunities to engage local volunteers in tangible and meaningful work. And then sometimes they even catalyze or inspire others to do additional wildlife friendly fencing projects as well.
And then the other aspect of the work that we mentioned earlier on is just working to protect public lands. And one of the things, there's a few things I want to note here is that every area requires a different approach. So each area is unique. There's a different community, and there's lots of different ways to protect public land. And on the left, you'll see the Snowcrest Range, and on the right, we're in the Gravelly Range. And both of these ranges are really important and unique. And so some of the ways in which we approach protecting public lands there are congressional designations. So there's the wilderness designation that we could explore. There's special management areas that are also congressional designations. And the thing to note about these particular designations, that if grazing is taking place there before the designation, it is it's allowed to continue on that landscape after the designation. Other ways, though, the congressional designations are not the only way to protect public lands. Other ways are cooperative management, cooperative monitoring. So getting partnerships out there on the landscapes together and really becoming stewards. So partnerships and stewardship programs with the different people who are working, recreating, and care about these places. So what's next? What we have coming is continued work out on the ground with our partners. So we've got a picture here of a gathering that was in Alder. I guess it was a couple years ago now, but we've got another gathering planned, and we're going to be doing another workshop, and it's one that people are interested in, and we're continuing to deliver what people are asking for. And then working on conflict reduction with operators out on the allotments, and continuing, I mean, this is the great part of our job, continuing to ride with people and get out on the ground and understand their operations in a deeper way. Brooke, what are the next steps for you?
Yeah, so we're headed into our second year partnering with Wildlife Services on the non-lethal conflict prevention specialist in the Gravellies. I think year one really illuminated a lot in terms of what went well and where there are opportunities for improvement. And it generated a lot of creative ideas in terms of new tools or techniques that could be implemented to improve cattle management and therefore better manage risk of predation, as well as better detect the kills that do occur to increase chances for compensation of losses. So we will be working with our partners to pursue some of these ideas and really continue to build out these conflict reduction efforts.
So some high level takeaways that we just wanted to share with you is that there are no easy answers. This is a slow process and it requires experimentation. One of the things that I've found has been really helpful is to keep an open perspective and to try and that's why I've got the handstand there is, what does it look like if I shift my view? I want to understand things from a different way. And I have a lovely quote from Wendell Berry that I wanted to share with all of you. He says, "You have to be able to imagine lives that are not yours." And that's one of the ways that we work. We really are trying to imagine lives that aren't ours. And so how can we be more compassionate, more open, and be better problem solvers because we're keeping all options on the table. And we try to not take ourselves too seriously. Brooke, what are some of your takeaways?
Yeah, you know, I entered into this work with Darcie with very specific wildlife goals in mind. I want to see wildlife succeed in navigating this public land, private land interface. And I know that these working ranch lands play an important role in keeping landscapes connected. And so with that, I think my biggest takeaway has really been the importance of being 100% transparent and honest around GYC's goals for wildlife when talking with our ranching partners, especially when we don't agree. I feel like that kind of dialogue really builds mutual respect, and it's the only real way to get to a place of understanding of shared values and in turn viable solutions. So with that, I think we would be happy to open it up for questions.
Hey, thank you so much, Darcie and Brooke. And yeah, sorry for some messages back and forth in the chat, but I've got a bunch of questions. And maybe before we get into questions, I just, from my end, want to express sort of how proud we at GYC are for the work that Darcie and Brooke have done, building these deep relationships with ranchers, finding common grounds, solving problems to the extent right now where occasionally when we talk to other partners, they sometimes think that Darcie is a rancher herself. You know, I think it just speaks to the level at which we have taken this work seriously, keeping sort of, you know, wildlife needs in mind, but also recognizing that we have to solve problems on the ground. There were so many questions in the chat, so if you don't mind, I will start with some of them. Brooke and Darcie, there was a question from Deborah about how supportive or helpful the city of West Yellowstone has been in working with us on protecting grizzly bears. Maybe Brooke, you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Deborah. And to be totally honest, that's just a realm that we haven't quite ventured into with our work in Southwest Montana. You know, we've been really focused in this Ruby Valley, Gravelly Mountain landscape, but you know, the conflicts that occur in West Yellowstone is certainly something on my radar screen, and I think something we'd like to explore working on in a more meaningful way in the future.
Thanks, Brooke. Patricia asks if we work with people and carnivores, and do we refer cattle owners to people and carnivores who do fencing, flagging, range riders, cameras, and other such work. I know we do some work. Why don't you guys speak?
Yeah, you know, I guess my answer to that is that I think one thing I've been really struck by in this landscape in particular is that the answers aren't as simple as flagging or fencing or things like that. You know, like those are amazing tools that are really effective at reducing conflicts in a lot of contexts, but this landscape is very different. Like there's not a real easy way to apply those kinds of tools to this setting and have them be effective. This is open range, and these riders have large landscapes to cover, and so it's just not really feasible for them to use things like electric fencing and flattery. Darcie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say we don't have an active partnership with them right now, but I would say we've benefited from the work that they've done in the past with building the bear poles and getting people set up with containers that, bear-proof containers. And so I feel like we're all doing our piece out there, and it's in a collective way. I feel the benefit of their work, and I'm hoping they feel the benefit of ours.
Thank you both. There was a question from Robert about if we are encouraged by the recent DOI initiative to emphasize working with private landowners. And I'm happy to take that if you want, Robert. And this is something more broadly. Darcie and Brooke lead our work in Southwest Montana, but GYC at large is involved in similar efforts with private landowners in Idaho and several parts of Wyoming. And overall, in other parts of Montana too, and overall, I think we recognize the crucial role that private lands play in conserving wildlife in some places, and the problems that private land, especially cattle ranches, bring in this part of the ecosystem. So we're very committed to finding solutions with them, working in partnership with them. And I think we had some role to play even in conversations with the administration early on during with the transition team, and now with people there, to try to get in some of their initiatives, whether it's 30 by 30 or their climate work, to prioritize listening and learning and working with landowners in sort of partnerships and doing that thoughtfully. I have another question here, Brooke and Darcie, from Robin, who asks, what is the greatest challenge you are currently facing?
Can you repeat that, Shiva?
Robin wants to know, what is the greatest challenge that we are currently facing?
Currently facing. I'll start, Brooke.
Okay.
Just from my perspective, I can feel the enormity of this landscape when I'm out there and when I'm talking to the producers and the working ranch hands or working cowboys. There's so much land to cover that really being effective in our conflict reduction, coexistence work feels like a really heavy lift. And I think what it's going to take is getting really creative around funding. It's going to get we need to get really creative around how do we, because this is a forever problem, right? We're going to be working in this forever in terms of cattle and cows and sheep and predators and depredation. So how do we secure funding over the long term so that these areas have the resources, the know-how, and the continuing research to come in and continue to do better and do better and do better? Because what we're learning is a little, like we were saying, it's a little bit. But I'm heartened by the partnerships that are forming all over the place. Like the Ruby Valley Strategic Alliance is not the only example of people coming together and doing good work. There are many examples of that taking place across the landscapes. And I think collectively, there's energy there. And so I don't know what that looks like moving forward, but I can feel that we're all heading in the same direction. And it's about keeping working ranches working, open spaces open, and bears alive. And so that's really what we're headed towards. But it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, Darcie, you were totally reading my mind. The thing that popped into my head was funding. The success of grizzly bear conservation in this region is really one for the ages. and it is coming with new challenges. And currently, the resources and capacity available through the agencies to address those challenges are not adequate to really rise to the challenge. So, you know, I feel like ultimately a key piece of this puzzle is going to be, you know, securing new creative sources of funding to support this kind of work.
Yeah, for sure.
Hey, thank you both so much. There was a comment from Bonnie about the Centennial Valley having a very successful range rider program. I don't know, Brooke or Darcie, if you want to speak a little bit to the work that we do with them.
Yeah, that is a great note. They do have a very successful range rider program, and they're great partners in our endeavors. And I guess as a side note, GYC also partners with Centennial Valley Association to support their range riding program. And then, you know, we do a lot of information sharing and exchange of ideas with the folks at Centennial Valley Association around the work we're doing over in the Ruby Valley. And for example, we have a workshop coming up next week, and we're co-hosting that workshop with the Centennial Valley Association to talk about how to manage cattle in grizzly bear and wolf country where cows are really scared all the time. So they're a great resource and a great partner in this work.
Hey, I have a couple more questions, and these are somewhat quick. I think these are from Deborah. She asks, what are the towns near or in the perimeter of the Ruby, and could you point that out on the map? So maybe you could go back to that early map and just point out some of the main towns. And while we're doing that, Brooke, there's also a more specific question about what height can deer, antelope, and elk jump of fences, or do they not jump fences?
Yeah, so I actually don't know what the exact height is for elk and deer. Do you, Shiva?
I don't know what the height they can jump is. Usually, in order to prevent them from crossing, we try to build 8-foot fences.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think an antelope usually don't jump, but I've seen them do that.
Yeah. Typically, pronghorn antelope will go underneath fences, and so that's, you know, when we're modifying fences, that's a really important piece, is moving the bottom wire strand up a little bit and replacing it with smooth wire instead of barbed wire, so that pronghorn can more easily slide under the fence without getting hung up. And then we typically do lower the top wire down like a foot or so from what the standard height is, to make it easier for deer and elk to jump over, but also make it so that it still is effective in containing cattle.
There's a question here from Loris asking about, when a rancher sells a ranch, the risk exists that the land will become houses. Ranches do sell from time to time. It happens. What prevents the ranch land from becoming more and more converted into housing over the decades?
Keeping them there. I think, I mean, that's really, it sounded, I don't mean that to sound not serious. I think that is the serious answer is, I mean, there are other tools like conservation easements and, you know, these conservation measures on the landscapes. And those are effective, very effective. It's just, it's voluntary. So ranchers have to, or private landowners would have to be willing to be willing to enter into that agreement and have some restrictions placed on that land on what could happen in the future. And that oftentimes is not very attractive to some folks. And so it's not always an option for them. So if that's not an option for them and they want to sell, then we probably would be seeing development come in. And the folks that we're working with, succession is also something in terms of the ranches moving on to the next generation so that they can keep operating. So that's something that we talk about. And I feel fortunate that the partners that we work with, succession looks really good for them. And so they have, family members who are going to be taking on that business down the road. They have those plans in place. And so that's also what keeps the developments from not coming in.
There seems to be a couple of themes, both from Loris and Ken and Colette, about population growth and, I guess, demographic movement or migration into the ecosystem. And the question, I guess, is how likely is it that state and local government in Montana will help mitigate landowners from selling out?
Ooh, I don't think I can answer that question. I don't know.
I mean, there's a broader question here, I guess, about, what is the responsibility of government to prevent local landowners from selling out? And do you want government interfering in landowner transactions about their private property? But I don't know if it's a debate we want to get into right now.
I was going to say that sounds like a great conversation over here.
I mean, I guess really, maybe I just take a chance to sort of underline sort of the point that Darcie and Brooke are making, which is that our best chance of keeping these lands open and keeping this wildlife habitat intact is finding ways to keep these ranching operations viable and successful, and finding ways in which they can continue to coexist and they can continue to thrive while wildlife thrives alongside them.
That's our goal.
I'm scrolling in here. I guess there's a question, are you working with any university partners to receive and implement new ideas? And do any universities have field research projects that we can participate, advise, or receive input from? Yeah, this is definitely something Brooke and Darcie you can talk about.
Yeah, Brooke, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. We're always exploring those kinds of ideas with potential research partners. The key is finding an idea that is that all the partners coalesce around and that can get funded and is possible to implement. And so, I think we haven't really landed on what that is yet, but that's certainly an important aspect of the work we want to do out there, is really encourage and facilitate good research to answer some of the questions that really need to be answered to be effective in reducing conflicts out there. And that's something that a lot of the ranchers we work with have really asked for, is, we need answers to some of these questions. And then, I think there's also sort of this larger context at a more regional scale in terms of the Western US and understanding conflict reduction across the West that is really being led by folks at Western Landowners Alliance and other universities. Darcie, do you want to speak to that component at all?
Sure, I can touch on it a little bit. And I will just note that Western Landowners Alliances, they've taken on the lofty goal of working with more of a West-wide group of people. And I really appreciate their outreach and their reach. And there is some work taking place there in partnership, and there are some studies being done, but nothing's being done down. And I'll just point out where we are, because there was that question too, in terms of this landscape. So this green, this public land kind of triangle is the gravelly range. And then there's the Snowcrest Mountains are down in here. So you saw both of those pictures. And this is where a lot of the public grazing takes place. A lot of the private land is up in this valley here, the Ruby Valley. And then you've got the Centennials down here. So when we were riding on the public allotment, we could see down into the Centennials. And so with all the great work that's taking place out there, we still, we need to figure out what we want to do out here and what the partnerships look like here and what kind of studies we want to get done with these broader opportunities that exist. Does that get to what you were thinking about, Brooke?
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to point out a couple of the towns there and the private in the valley, Darcie?
My poor eyeballs are,
Okay. We've got, I mean, it's Virginia City, Alder, Twin Bridges are kind of the landmarks there. Bozeman is up to the right along the interstate.
yeah. And then I'm trying to, yeah, it's, I mean, they're just little communities out there. Twin is a pretty small community. Virginia City is pretty small. Alder, which is where we're going to hold our workshop, very small community.
Hey, we're pretty much out of time. I'll take one last question here that someone, I think Deborah put in. And she asks if ranchers are reimbursed for cattle that are killed, and if so, by whom? And then maybe after that, we'll wrap up.
So in Montana, there's an entity called the Livestock Loss Board within the Department of Agriculture that manages a pot of funding that can be dispersed to landowners when they lose livestock to predation by wolves, grizzly bears, and mountain lions. And being able to get that reimbursement requires, you know, documenting the kill and confirming that it was in fact a kill by a predator and not, you know, death from a natural cause. And so what that requires is calling in Wildlife Services, which is the agency sort of tasked with investigating these kills in Montana. And then they confirm whether or not it was a predation, and then the landowner can then be reimbursed. If it is confirmed, it can be reimbursed for the market value of that animal. However, that is no small feat. Like, oftentimes these dead cows are, you know, a dead cow one day and the next day a skeleton, because there are so many animals out there on the landscape scavenging on these dead cattle. And so response time by Wildlife Services to investigate that site is really important. And oftentimes it's just simply impossible to get there quick enough to be able to confirm what the cause of death was. And then, you know, there's also instances where, you know, at the end of the season, these ranchers come up short, and sometimes these cattle are not even found. And so the cause of death is unknown. But what we do know is that the number of those unconfirmed losses has increased over time. And, you know, oftentimes ranchers are getting compensated for only a very small fraction of their total losses, potentially to predation.
Hey, Brooke and Darcie, thank you so much. That was awesome. Couldn't be more proud of the work that you guys are doing for GYC in the landscape. And thank you all so much for giving us an hour of your time and supporting GYC and being willing to listen to the work that we do. If you liked this webinar, next Tuesday, we have another one coming up. Christy, if you could go back to the previous slide. We sort of, this talks a little bit about gold mining on the edge of Yellowstone and the work that we're doing against that. So would love to see as many of you there as we could. That's going to be exciting and more fun. And if you like this work and you'd like to support our organization, we, as Brooke said, could always use funding support. Please visit our website, greateryellowstone.org/donate. And we would be glad to get any support you can. Thank you again all so much for spending your afternoon an hour with us, and hope to see you again in a few weeks. And if any of you not in the ecosystem do come by, don't hesitate to visit, to drop in and say hello. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was a great
Bye-bye.
presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks,
tonight.
everyone.
You're welcome.
Fabulous, Darcie, thanks.
Thanks,
And
Janet.
Brooke and Shiva too. Thanks, wonderful.
Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Janet.
Just opening up the chat for the first time.
Are you guys still there?
Yes, we are.
Yes.
My name is Marty, and I think I represent a very unique group of people for your cause, and that is tour guides. We are taking people through Wyoming and Montana. I mean, bus loads, 50 people on a bus, 80 buses a season, just multiple companies are out there. And what I'm wondering is, do you have plans with your funding to create maybe a 10 or 15-minute CD that talks about the coalitions that you've developed, that talks about land managed, BLM land versus private land, what they're used for, just many of the things that you mentioned in tonight's presentation. I'm on the East Coast, so in tonight's presentation. And is there a way to distribute that? Because we have people from all over the United States and the world who are on our coach, and we have lots of downtime to present information and then to remind people when it comes time for meals, or when you're standing in line, or as an opportunity to get to know each other, to maybe talk about what they think regarding some of these issues. Is there any of that in the works?
Hey, Marty, this is Christy. I would love to connect with you after this webinar and talk through some of these ideas. Yes, we can help get the word out, and we have those pieces to help. So let's maybe connect with you after this talk, and you and I can chat through and talk about how we can help.
Sure, and you have my information, is that correct?
I think I do. If you've registered, that I would all be able to find you.
Sure, just email me and
Okay.
my number, and we can chat.
Okay, perfect. That would be wonderful. We'll do that.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.